Just 2 days ago, Canada became the second country in the world to legalize cannabis. Canada is also the first industrialized nation, when the first country is actually Uruguay, which legalized the use and sale of cannabis way back in 2013. So Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau also made a statement saying that by legalizing the sale of weed in the country, they want to eat into the profits of the drug cartels and make use of that money for, that they get from people who purchase weed in the country. So this has sort of sparked off a conversation in India whether India can legalize cannabis. We all know that India has a historic use of cannabis. It's recorded, and it has been used in Ayurvedic practices as well. So in ThePrint, Shashi Tharoor, MP, who co-authored a piece advocating the sale of cannabis in India, and he also recommended the establishment of a government-run medical cannabis program so that this drug can be prescribed to and used by patients in medical need. So we are taking questions live today on where India is on the path to legalizing cannabis, or whether it is possible at all in India. Do send in your questions, and we will take them live. So before we start off discussing the use of cannabis in India, we have this important piece of legislation, the Narcotropic Substances and Psychotropic Drug Act, the NDPS Act, which basically bans the sale, use, consumption, production of a number of drugs in India. So this includes certain pharmaceutical drugs and also naturally available intoxicants, like weed, for example. This law came into effect way back in the 70s, and since then the objective of the law is basically to curb all drug consumption in the country. So it uses a number of ways to achieve its goals, and some of the ways is it imposes mandatory minimum sentences, which could start from 10 years to 20 years for repeat offences. It also imposes what we call in law as a strict liability. So it doesn't matter whether you possess the banned substance with an intention to use or not. You're walking on the street, the bag is found in your, the substance is found in your bag, a policeman catches you, you will be liable under the Act. So this is strict liability under the Act. And many experts have called this NDPS Act a draconian legislature because it also imposes death penalty for certain repeat offences. And the Act significantly does not distinguish between a user, a mule, a peddler, or a trafficker. Although there is a certain distinction wherein if you are caught with quantities of, which are minor quantities, that you get the mandatory minimum sentence. If you're caught with something like which is categorized as commercial quantities, then that could lead to stronger punishments. So the NDPS Act is what governs the use of such substances in India. So we are, since we are taking questions, we have the first question here, which is the status of marijuana legal or illegal in India? So, like I was saying, it is right now illegal in India. So, but what we need to know about the NDPS Act, which makes it illegal in India, is that since states have powers to amend this law to a certain extent, there are some states which have allowed certain exemptions. For example, in Orissa, there is a cultural practice where consumption is allowed for recreational purposes in very small minor quantities. So we see, we have Tathagat Satpathy, an MP from Orissa, wherein he said in his constituency, the use of weed is acceptable, and since it is not completely illegal, he also advocates removing the prohibition against sale of weed completely, and he also calls for something. He also calls for its medicinal use, restricted by the government, of course, regulated heavily by the government, but he also advocates permitting it. So since we are talking about lawmakers who are open to the idea of removing the prohibition on weed, apart from Shashi Tharoor, Tathagat Satpathy, we also have Aam Aadmi Party MP Dharamveer Gandhi, who is a doctor by practice. He also advocates removing the ban on weed. Minister Menaka Gandhi has also in the past said that imposing a ban is only going to increase the use of drug, and instead the ban should be removed, and it should be allowed, very restrictedly allowed in India. And she's also said that we could use some of the profits that come from the sale of weed to educate people about the harmful effects of consumption of drugs. Like it happens in tobacco, it happens in alcohol. If you notice, the tax that is imposed by the government on alcohol and tobacco is very high, and a large sum of this money is actually used to spread awareness amongst the public on the use of such substances. Our next question is from Hansa, and she is asking about Amsterdam. Amsterdam is considered the weed capital of the world, but is weed legal or illegal there? Like I said, consumption of weed is actually legal in only 2 countries as of now, which is Uruguay and Canada. In the United States, a number of states have allowed the use of weed, but it's not a nationwide use of the substance. Amsterdam, however, is a very tricky way of allowing the consumption of weed. I'm sure a lot of you would know that there are coffee shops, the famous coffee shops in Amsterdam, which allow, where you can go and purchase weed for recreational purposes, up to 5 grams usually. So the policy in Amsterdam is that although on the law says that it is illegal, the state prosecution in Amsterdam has taken a policy which is called a tolerance policy, so that they will not prosecute those who are found with such small quantities used only for recreational purposes. So if you are in Amsterdam, you want coffee, you actually go to a cafe or any other place, but the coffee shop specifically, you don't go there to buy coffee, but you go there to buy weed. So it is also a sort of surrogate advertising, where they all brand themselves as coffee shop because by law they are not allowed to advertise that they sell weed over there. So Amsterdam that way is a very different, it's a very unique situation. It's neither legal nor completely illegal in Amsterdam, but the government tolerates the consumption of weed to a certain extent. So what happens is, even if you're caught, you won't be punished, you won't be prosecuted for it, but it's not completely legal. Our next question is from Nikhil, and Nikhil is asking, what is the guarantee after becoming legally available, weed becomes technically inaccessible? So there are a number of ways at looking at how this will be made legal. So because what parliamentarians have been addressing so far is to allow medicinal uses, like opium in India. Opium is produced in India, although it is produced only in factories that are regulated by the government in certain very specific areas. Till last year, the biggest opium factory in India in Ghazipur was actually shut down, which had existed for about 100 years. So in these places, the production is very restricted, and then how it is packaged, how it is processed, how it is tested in labs, these have to be very different processes. Since we don't know, India hasn't discussed a plan, so to say, to legalize weed, we don't know what way it will take. But way back in the 1893, the British government, when it was in India, had in fact constituted a committee to look into whether there should be a law that will allow consumption of weed. This is popularly known as the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission, and the commission in fact recommended that if used in small quantities, it almost has no harmful effects in the brain, and therefore in India it should be allowed. And they had taken testimonies of a number of traditional medicinal practitioners, people who consume weed, and had said that India, since it has a cultural history in India, it should be allowed to a certain extent. But after that, the NDPS Act, as we know, has come as a complete crackdown against any sort of consumption of this drug. Our next question is from Ratnadeep, and he's asking if it will help in popularizing cannabis use openly in India to an extent which is dangerous. So again, to answer this question, to what extent is the use dangerous or not? The same thing goes for alcohol, tobacco, and substances like that. The government tells you that it is dangerous. When you buy a packet of cigarettes, 86% of the packaging is actually warning symbols telling you that it causes cancer. But a certain section, the argument that is made for legalization is really that individuals should have the power to do whatever they want with their bodies. So if you want to do something that is harmful to you, you should be allowed, and the state shouldn't restrict it. That's sort of the idea that that the Amsterdam government also had taken into consideration to have a tolerance policy. So of course, to what extent it will be permissible in India, its use is harmful, that of course we will have to see, but that already exists for things like alcohol and tobacco, like I said, and still people consume it fully knowing its effects on themselves. So even in a situation where weed is legalized, that will be the way forward. Our next question is Simran, who's asking how real is the possibility of the legislation in India, which I think she basically means how real is the possibility of us of India legalizing the use of weed. So to answer that question, in short, we are nowhere on thinking about that. So we have certain voices which have come forward and talked about it. Bangalore, Bombay are places where you see certain movements where citizens have sort of demanded that we should legalize the use of it. But apart from the 3 or 4 MPs we talked about, and also Patanjali CEO Acharya Balakrishna, we really don't have strong voices in India which have advocated the use of which have advocated that weed consumption must be legalized. So we're nowhere on the radar. But there are 2 countries now which have, of course, like Canada and Uruguay, which have gone ahead and legalized it. And if there are studies that show that it actually curtails consumption of drugs. To give you an example, what Canada is also looking at is, they say when you make it criminal to consume a drug, you only make it, you only stigmatize the person who is an addict. So an addict's place is not the jail, but actually where he can where his addiction should be treated medically. So this is sort of the reason why it has happened. So if there are 2 countries which have gone ahead, and if there is a global movement and India does think of it, that's an entirely different case. But right now we are nowhere on the radar, even on thinking about legalizing weed in India. Our next question is from Shreyas, and Shreyas is asking, since marijuana is popular in Indian mythology and culture in general, why is it such a taboo in a legal course? So till about the 70s, it was completely legal in India. You had government stores, in fact, selling small amounts of weed in India. So, in fact, what prompted India to bring in such a legislation, such a strongly worded legislation, is actually certain international treaties that we have. UN has had about 3 major conventions between the 60s and 70s, which declared a war on drug trafficking in the world, and said that we have to come down heavily on drug production, consumption, and everything connected. So India was, in that sense, forced. For about 30 years, India did withstand that pressure from the international community. There was a lot of pressure from the US government to bring in such a legislation, but ultimately we did give in when Rajiv Gandhi was the Prime Minister, and the legislation was brought about. So, and after the legislations come up, there have been at least 3 amendments increasing this. But what now we have a situation is where the UN is actually saying that our war on drugs, which has taken place for the last 50 years, has in fact failed. So which has prompted, again, international thinkers to say, maybe we should look at how we address this problem. So in India, the address was major clampdown, just put everybody in jail. So that hasn't really worked as a deterrent. So and an example for that is really Punjab. A study has said that in 2015, about 40% of all prisoners in Punjab's jails were in fact booked under the NDPS Act. In Patiala in 2015, 90% of all prisoners were under the NDPS Act. So when Punjab has such strong laws, such high rates of conviction, why is there still a major drug problem in Punjab? So the UN has also looked at studies like this, which said maybe we've looked at this whole thing in the wrong way. So if there is a rethink, then it could lead to a change of situation. But legally, I mean, it became a taboo in India, although we have cultural practices, is because of this legislation and the international pressure that was in India to adopt such a stance. In fact, the Hindu wrote an editorial in Hindu's editorial when this NDPS Act was promulgated, saying that India has gone back 100 years by bringing in a ban on cannabis. So it was very acceptable at that time, and it's a legislation which has taken this turn. Our next question is from Naveen, and he's asking what are the commercial opportunities of legalizing marijuana. So when we say legalizing it, there are of course different ways and methods. One could just simply be for medicinal purposes, or like we've seen in Amsterdam, it could be for recreational purposes, or it could be a complete removal of the ban, so, and say use it however you want to. So in the first and second case, in the first case at least, where it's only for medicinal uses, the commercial activity will be restricted to that area, and the government can heavily control that. Like we see how opium is manufactured in India. There are designated factories, and even employees who work in these opium manufacturing factories are given a full thorough check when they leave the premises, so that they don't carry any of the drug outside. So it's heavily regulated in that sense in India. So let's say in Canada right now, what the commercial use we're seeing is, when people go out to buy weed, it's not really the brick and mortar stores that they go to. It's really, happening on the internet. There are websites which sell it, the websites which deliver it to your house, and things like that. So the commercial opportunity there in that sense is sort of unlimited, but it really depends on to what extent the use of weed will be legalized. Our next question is from Arun, and he's asking if pharma giants monopolize the industry, if it is legalized, or will we see more private players? So again, right now, there are some sections which are advocating that they should be, the ban should be removed, but we really don't know to what extent. There is no study, there is no commission study by the government, or they haven't even thought about removing the ban. So if at all that situation happens, we will have to see whether it will allow only pharma giants or private players. But if the point is really that if the state is not regulating it, then there will be opportunity for private players. There is a chance that the state could actually monopolize it, and like if you've ever been to Banaras, you will see government stores selling bhang for you. So that is really the state monopolizing the sale of such substances. So that could be a very possible scenario. But if the state decides to let private players come into picture, that's when you will have even pharma giants or private individual players coming into this at all. Our next question is from Anaga, and she is asking if it were legalized, will it come under the central list or state list, and should it be legalized for both medical and recreational purpose? So the second part of question, should it be legalized for both medical and recreational purposes, we leave that question open to policymakers to decide. But the first part of that question is whether it will be under the state list or central list. So the NDPS Act is central legislation. However, since it involves police and prosecution, which are state subjects, states do have powers to amend this law and bring in changes. So that's how we see small exemptions granted in Orissa, or Punjab taking it to another level and making it stringent year by year. So states will have a say in how to regulate the sale and consumption of weed. Certain states can still choose not to remove the ban. Certain states can show a liberal view and remove the ban. So our next question is from Pranay, and Pranay is asking, the conversation about cannabis is limited to certain urban demographics. On the other hand, the protest for legislation in US, Canada saw the involvement of a larger population. Will this hamper chances of legislation in India? Pranay, the fact of the matter is we still don't have any sort of mass movement in India which is talking about legalizing cannabis. Like I said, it's only, these protests and certain demonstrators we've seen in cities like Bombay and Bangalore once in a while, and we've had not even a handful of MPs talk about it and openly advocate it. So So there isn't, to say, I mean, it is of course limited to urban demographics perhaps, but there is no movement at all. So, but if the government does think about removing the ban, lifting the prohibition, then it will have to come, it will probably come not because of a mass movement, but really because of, the economic importance of doing it, the business of sale and consumption of weed. If the government sees profits in it, and if it can be looked at as a source of income for the government, that's perhaps what will drive the change, and not really a mass movement. Our next question is from Omkar, and he's asking if you legalize marijuana in India, can the same be done with other drugs like LSD, etc.? So again, coming back to why we talk extensively about weed is because it has some sort of cultural significance in India. Its use has been historic, it's documented, and it is, in that sense why we talk about using, even countries like Canada and Uruguay haven't legalized other drugs. It's only weed, which studies have shown again and again that it is, it can be used for medicinal purposes, and its harm on human body is minimum to negligent, if at all there is any. So which is why, so other psychotropic substances like LSD or other drugs could still continue to be regulated by the government, like how it is done right now. But what is happening right now is, although weed is deemed pretty much not harmful, it is put under the same category in the NDPS Act. So there is no distinction between consumption of weed or consumption of cocaine to that extent. So all these drugs are put under the same basket in the NDPS, which is one of the criticisms against the legislation. So if at all they try to categorize this, create a hierarchy, then you will only have the less harmful drugs removed from the list and not all the drugs. Our next question is from Shubleen, and she is asking, how will legislation and regulation of cannabis impact the drug epidemic in states like Punjab? Yes, so we already talked about Punjab. NDPS Act sees a really high rate of conviction in Punjab because of how the act is structured. The prosecution does not have to prove intention. So if someone is caught with certain quantity of the drug on them, that's enough to secure a conviction in Punjab. So although 40% of Punjab's prisons were filled with people consuming the drug, there hasn't really been a change of situation. So it is for states like these to look at what really are the deterrents. Is it fear of jail, or is it something else? And like I said, the act really doesn't differentiate between traffickers, peddlers, users and mules. So if it is a trafficker and a peddler, they don't get any more stringent punishment than a user gets. And for a user who is in possession of this drug, of whatever quantity, like studies have shown again and again, their place is not in jails but in rehabilitation centers. So perhaps a complete overhaul of how we look at drug legislations in India is required to deal with the drug menace in states like Punjab. The next question we have is from Naresh, and he's asking if bhang is a byproduct of cannabis and accepted in Indian society, where does it fall in this scenario? So the NDPS Act is actually, it's actually got a lot of details on how exactly you can consume this. In certain cases, like for example poppy, it restricts the use of seeds and this one, but consumption of leaves is allowed to a certain extent. So the act is it goes into minute details on how it can be consumed. Bhang also, as of now, it's not completely illegal, although although it is heavily regulated and sale happens through government stores. That doesn't mean that you don't get it otherwise. Like it is the case with all drugs, there is a mafia that has come up. There's a black market where you can get hold of all of these drugs. But what in the case of bhang, it's really that the government does distribute it. In states like UP, like I said, there are stores where you can go and buy. So the government does allow bhang use to a certain extent, although it is more freely available in the black market. So if at all these drugs are legalized, the use is permitted, this is what the government will be tapping in to get into the trade of the black market and sort of take off those profits for the government. Do keep watching this space on ThePrint.in. Follow us on YouTube, and we'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth conversations about policy and politics. Thank you for watching.